And now we're going to transition to the CEO circle. I realize there are three, so it's sort of a triangle, but we're going to morph it into a circle. And let me just very briefly introduce each of our CEOs, and then I will invite them to join us on the stage. So we have Karel van de Sompel, who's the country manager of Pfizer, Belgium and Luxembourg. And you have been there, I think, for 30 years, correct? So I suspect you have a number of interesting perspectives, sort of the before and after, the longitudinal perspective, which we look forward to hearing. Thank you and welcome. And we have Els Blaton, who is the CEO of Everest, which is a consultancy group. And I gather one of the top 10 in the IT business consulting. And I was interested to see also that you were at AXA Belgium for a period of time, and that you're very interested in some social themes. So I thought it was very interesting that you're on the advisory board of PASS work, which deals with people with autism spectrum disorder. So that, I think, in terms of a social justice perspective, could be very interesting. So welcome, Els. And last but not least, Erwin Ollivier, who participated earlier this morning, who's the general manager of Alphon. And president of Chamber of Commerce of Brabant, and also a previous recipient of the Women at Work Awards. So congratulations. So I think we have a very dynamic, diverse panel, and I would welcome you to the music. You're welcome to dance on the way up here if you would like. So please join me. We may need to share mics, so we'll pass them on. So, you know, it's interesting because one of the things I often think about in the gender equity space is how do we define success, right? So we could say that it's numerical representation and so on, but I think we would all agree it's much more than that. At the same time, I think if we don't, you know, that notion that if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. So I think it would be extremely interesting, before we get into the how, if you could share with us your reflections on the why. You know, how do you define success in the gender equity space, and why do you see it as so vital to business performance at this point? So again, tapping into Peter's comment about the ambition, how would you capture that? Erwin?
I think when it doesn't become a topic on the agenda anymore, then I would say it's a success. But then how to measure that is very difficult. From my point of view, I think if I'm able to change the mindset in the organization, the way we run the business in a way that people don't have to choose between how they organize their life and how they organize their professional life, I think we would have come a long way. So if people feel they get all the chances and it's their choice to go left or right, then I would say that's, for me, is success.
Mm-hmm. So a sense of that personal empowerment. Choice. Yeah.
I would like to build on that one. I think the personal choice for me is very important. When women and men can make their own choices, give their best in what they do, from an employee perspective, that's going to be very satisfying. And I do believe that when the organization can breathe that, that's going to be, for me, the end success. Mm-hmm. From a business perspective, I'm a strong believer that when you have a diverse set of leadership teams, because an organization has many leadership teams, you're going to make better decisions. Mm-hmm. And it's going to pay off at the end. Now, how to measure that? It's difficult to measure that in I would say, top line, because it's difficult to measure the before and after. But what we do at Pfizer is we have a yearly, I would say, the Pfizer voice, where people really can speak out and then show their engagements or not, mm-hmm. vis-a-vis certain topics. And that's how we can measure progress. And that's where we have seen moving the needle over the last few years.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Good example. And Rose?
Well, I'm quite aligned with what my colleagues were telling. So for me, success in achieving gender balance is when you have throughout the company an open mindset and this culture where everyone together jointly promotes men and women, promotes gender balance, and that it's indeed not a topic where you have a workshop in a closed environment, but that's normal, and that it's an open discussion how we can go forward, what we have to do in order that everyone feels recognized, appreciated, and equal one to the other.
And just to be a little provocative, because this morning I mentioned some of the Gallup statistics, which are rather depressing at this point. So, in terms of levels of engagement in the global workforce, levels of trust. Trust is at an all-time low. So one of the issues often is this whole notion of speaking truth to power. Because I think to some extent it's a chicken and egg problem, because you obviously, each of you articulated that desire to be open, being truthful, being forthcoming, and yet there is this anxiety. Are there consequences for that in terms of perhaps career security? So when I do look at cultural audits in companies, often people say, the rhetoric is good, it's convincing, but I still am not necessarily comfortable going out on a limb to articulate my particular concerns. What would be any example that any one of you could share of, how do you elicit that truth-telling? Because that whole notion of hierarchy somehow, implies, well, I can be this category of truthful with this person and then this other category of truthful. But I think there is a lot of maybe even self-consciousness about, well, how forthcoming can I be? And I think truth-telling to power becomes an interesting question, because obviously, and I don't know if all of your companies are doing this unconscious bias training, but clearly that's feeding into the anxiety, that if I articulate this, I'm going to be perceived as this kind of person. And so I think there's a lot of second guessing in terms of just truthfulness of communication. So if any of you have any views on that, because it's a tough one, I think.
It's really a tough one. So when I took on the role of general manager for Athlon, I engaged on a cultural change program with the entire organization. We were very top-down, hierarchical organized, and I wanted an empowered company. 2 years ago, we moved to a new office facility, which we built around the new way of working concept with free seating, so no departments, no offices. And what I noticed is when I go and sit somewhere, all the chairs around me stay empty. While I kept on saying, I want to reach out, I want to talk to you, I'm just one of your colleagues. I also want to chat and talk about my kids, etc. So I had to change my pattern, and I had to go and sit where other people were sitting, because otherwise there was always that barrier. That barrier. So it's really a tough one, because it's so culturally innate to, and especially in Belgium, maybe in other cultures also, but we are a nation where people rarely speak up. They try to give messages that are hidden in between the text. And that's very difficult. So I encourage my people and my managers to, if they have an issue, to come and talk to me. I now have the reputation that people know I don't judge on what they say. I just take it as information. I don't give an opinion right away. I try to gather more pieces of information and then come back with a response. And I see that's a system that works. People more and more come to me directly with any issue. It can be on abuse, on frustration, on topics that they think are very uncomfortable to talk about. Even putting a situation on the table where they directly confront me with a situation with one of my direct reports. But people know that I'll take the action in order to improve the organization and not to punish the individual.
Well, I think indeed it's a lot about having a role model in the company. Now I have a small anecdote to tell. Some 10 years ago, when I was still working for AXA, I was rather convinced that I had a close relation with the people, and I spent some time and I planned some time at the coffee machine to talk with them, and so I thought I really know what is ongoing in the teams and so on. And then all of a sudden, okay, some things happened. There were some surprises, and luckily in the middle management I had some people that I really could trust and with whom I was working, and then you heard completely different stories. And that's where I realized it's a bit the empty chairs around you. It's a bit the same, that okay, there remains somewhere this gap. Now I'm working in a completely different company, and I still take my coffee and I still try to have the chats with everyone, but I found a way around in order to listen to people and to try through the middle management to have this way, so that to the middle management, through the HR department and so on, really to see what are the different angles, what are the different stories, and then go to people in an open discussion to say, I heard this, I heard that, and try to have this information. But indeed, it remains difficult to remain close, and although there is not really an hierarchy in the company, it's really a flat structure in a consultancy company, you feel that the barriers remain there, and you have to work on it every day in order to really know what are the issues in the company.
No, it's helpful.
Well, the role of leaders and a leadership team is quite important. The role modeling is quite important, and that's an enormous task, and it's tough. It's really tough to make it happen. Now, one of the things we did at Pfizer, and it might seem a little bit the American way, within our culture, which is a very entrepreneurial culture, we have set something forward, which kind of one of the themes was 3-4 years ago, straight talk. And it was, we even developed a coin, a straight talk coin, which we could put on the table if someone wanted to have a discussion with his peers or with his boss or with his boss's boss. And although it was very symbolic, because right now we don't use the coin anymore, but we still would say, let's have straight talk. And that moved the needle. We are not there yet, because if you would ask senior leaders what is the biggest challenge we still have, it would still be, but speaking up to the real, telling the truth to the real top, that's still where it's, if our CEO from the US is coming, are we really daring to say what's on our heart? Probably not yet. So there's still some work to be done.
Yeah.
Can maybe to add on that, what we often do with top teams on the battery is an exercise called the personal history. And it's a very simple exercise, but a very powerful one, because we see in the research that the maturity of an organization is very determining on the success of the change. And lower maturity organizations don't dare to speak up, and they don't dare to be truthful, because they are afraid about their positions. But to give that a boost, what we do is we put people around a table and we make 10 to 15 questions. And the questions are the types like, when was the last time you cried? Or what was the most difficult decision in your life? Or these kind of questions. But also, what is according to you, your best strength? Or how would you describe your youth? And the chairman, the one organizing the exercise, starts. And you get 15 minutes of talk. And you can't be interrupted. Nobody can ask questions. You do it, you stop, and then you say who wants to go next. And you do that with the whole team. And it's every time again unbelievable what people hear from each other. Even people who work together for 10 to 15 years, they say like, I never knew that from you. And there you see that people start to realize that you are working with human beings. Even your CEO is a human being. Right? And that makes people understanding that being honest and truthful and sometimes vulnerable isn't a bad thing at all. It's a very good thing. And if you repeat it enough with all the leadership teams, then you see that they're slowly it's moving the needle into, I can be honest with you without being hit by you, because I have my vulnerabilities and so do you.
Yeah, and I think you're all making a really interesting point, and that is above and beyond our individual personalities and styles and so on, there is this legacy culture, sort of these expectations and assumptions that we bring to a workplace. I think a leader looks like this, and I think this is how a meeting is conducted, and so on. So to some extent, there's a whole energy that has to be devoted, I think, to either challenging or unlearning some of those assumptions. And I love the idea of the coin, just, making something quite physical. And it reminds me of a conversation I had with a woman who is Dutch. And she told me she was getting very negative feedback about her style of communication. And she said, I'm perceived as being very harsh, a little bit too direct, et cetera. And she said, this is really a style of communication, and it's tough for me because that is not my intention, but I'm not coming across well. And so I gave her a recommendation that she would say to her team when she was going to be presenting something, I'm just about to speak Dutch. And that was the warning that, listen, it may come across as harsh, but that is not my intention. And it became actually part of a almost kind of a storytelling element in the team. So everyone in the team started using that. I'm about to speak Dutch, which is, I've reached my point of no return, so I'm just going to be really direct, but my intention is not to insult anyone or make anyone uncomfortable. So it's often these personal gestures that can be so powerful. And that leads me to another example that I just wanted to share. Part of the debate we've had today is, the policies, the practices, the playbook, and all of this. And I was at a client the other day, and I arrived a little bit early, and there were 2 dogs that were in the foyer. So I thought, oh, how wonderful, because I happen to be a dog lover. So the person I was meeting with brought me in, and then I suddenly noticed a lot of dogs. And I said, oh, my word, what's with the dogs? And they said, oh, it's dog day. So we decided we didn't want casual Fridays, we want dog day. So I went into a conference room, and there were 15 dogs lined up, all, looking perfectly happy, waiting for the meeting to start. And I was just intrigued with how that changed the meeting. I mean, before I got over the shock value of all these dogs panting and so on, but I thought, again, that element of humanity and how we bring in more perspectives rather than, touting whatever we think our role and responsibility and job title and so on. So I just wanted to throw that out as an example to see, you look like you were going to respond, if that resonates with you in terms of that self-disclosure and just being a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and I wanted to pick up on what Peter said about the batteries. I think what is so frustrating for me is the amount of energy we waste in our companies by just playing a role. And the more you're in the hierarchy, you're more faced with people playing roles. And I think it's such a waste of time. Okay. So if I could convince my organization and my people to just be themselves and let the others learn that you don't judge, you just take it in, I think we would all be a lot happier.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and just to throw out another example, I was working once with a CEO of one of the global automotive companies. So he had this precise anxiety. He said, I cannot stand it when I walk through the manufacturing arm, et cetera. Oh, my word, everyone literally straightens their ties and, moves into a different kind of body language. And he said, I'd love to do something dramatic. Do you have any dramatic ideas? I said, well, here's a wild idea. Why don't you issue everybody a business card that says responsible employee, including you? And for 6 months, that's the job title on every business card. He said, now I like that. So for 6 months, it's a Japanese automotive company, they had responsible employee written on the business card. It was fascinating to see what the reaction was also from clients. Well, I would hope you're responsible. It's good to know you're also employed. But again, it brought a level of accessibility, engagement, and so on. But it is interesting, isn't it? Sort of the scaffolding that we rely on to build our own credibility when we are in fact talking about authenticity all the time. So I would throw that out to all of you is, in terms, and there's a certain, in all honesty, cynicism about, oh, my word, yes, authentic, yeah. Your definition and my definition might be slightly different. Any perspectives on, again, how we can crack that nut to actually let people know actually that authenticity is part of leadership. You know, the degree to which each and every one of us can be more self-disclosing is a terrific trait to attract that followership.
Well, I do believe that authenticity goes together with your ability to show vulnerability at the same time. Because you need to, if you don't have that, then you can't be authentic. You need to be able to show that things, you might have failed, that things not always went well, that you have your own story to tell, and with the emotions, with the rationals, with the ratio playing, but you're just a human being. And I still remember when I took over the Belgian organization 5 years ago, some of my former colleagues, I worked with her about 15 years ago, and she came to me, "You have changed. You're not the same one anymore." I said, "Well, I hope I have changed, because 15 years later I do evolve." But what she meant that all of a sudden I started to behave as the general manager. I wasn't myself anymore. I wasn't authentic anymore. And this is where I had to have a declick almost. I need to behave differently. I need to be myself. I'm okay. I don't need to show as the big boss. I can lead without showing off. And so I do believe that it's very, very important. However, it's not that easy for each and every one. That you can see in a leadership team that some people have trouble, I would say, demonstrating their vulnerability.
Right, exactly. Did you?
Well, indeed, personally, I'm convinced that it's only when you're authentic that you can be credible and that you can create credibility in the organization. I think that leaders or people that should be leaders and that are not behaving in an authentic way, well, it's the recipe for failure. Whatever you want to do, whether it be on gender equality or other topics, I think gender authenticity is really the key element in order to be successful. And I do agree it's not easy because it's showing your small parts also, your small things in your character, your weaknesses, and to use them in the daily life. So it's far more easy to show up and to say, I'm the one and I'm taking the decisions and so on. It's far more easy to say, okay, I'm taking these decisions, but I'm doubting, or I think we should do this or that, but maybe I'm not completely sure. But on the other hand, once you're there, I think it's a strength. It becomes a strength in the company, because it's much more easy to have the buy-in of your complete team and of all the people around. And that's where it becomes strong.
Yeah, and I think your point, though, is really interesting from a gender perspective, because often when I speak to women about being vulnerable, their response is often, actually, I feel vulnerable from the get-go. So, to some extent, I'm trying to play or figure out how to play this game where I can be recognized for my talents, my abilities, and so on. And again, a funny anecdote, I remember sitting in a meeting and somebody said to a colleague, this is a professional services firm, "Oh, Mary must have become a partner today." And I said, "Oh, that's terrific." I said, "How do you know?" "She's wearing orange." And I said, "Well, what's with the orange?" "Oh, no, you always wear black and gray and brown, and you try to blend in, and then when you make partner, the color starts to appear." And I thought, how interesting in terms of sort of the color, literally the metaphor. I mean, because when we say, the color appears, energy, personality, individuality, and so on. But again, it's fascinating, this folklore, I don't know what else to call it, that sort of creates the norms and conditions of behavior and the basis upon which you feel credible, and how you can, without fear of consequence, actually wear orange before you're a partner. It would be very interesting to see what would happen.
Maybe to add to that, what we see though is in companies where you are able to put people into their talents and absolutely into their strengths. you don't need to manage these people. And of course, you get into these self-steering teams and agility, but like we did with KBC, for instance, where we did the whole digital transformation with them together, and the 250 people who were put in the speedboat of creating the apps, I've never seen in my whole life as motivated people as they are. You don't need to manage them, you don't need to motivate them, you don't need to ask them to be authentic, because they are. And I think honestly the real essence today of leadership is to not to work on weaknesses of people, but to create a context where people feel that what they do is valuable, makes a lot of sense, and that they can use their talent with who they are. And that to me is the essence of leadership. And then people are authentic.
Well, and it builds into this co-creation argument, because more and more companies are saying, actually, if we hire people for their abilities and their ambitions, maybe we should co-create a job description around those strengths. So again, can we somehow change some of the paradigms in terms of how we onboard people, how we obviously keep them engaged and inspired. I'd love to chat, just have a question about failure, because this comes up in a lot of conversations about risk-taking and so on. And again, it goes back to the issue of the messaging versus the reality. Do you have any comments, either in terms of your own career, how you dealt with failure, addressed it, came to terms with it, had to deal with it, that you think could lend some interesting insight? Because I do think things will not work out. And it's part of, as you said, our growth perspectives and how we evolve. But again, that is a very big taboo issue in terms of companies, people not feeling comfortable owning up to mistakes, et cetera. And yet, they're encouraged to take significant risks. And yes, we want to see creativity and innovation and risk-taking and so on. So again, there's a sort of a mixed message there, I think. But any feelings about the word failure? Is it even relevant? Do we need a new word that would not perhaps carry such baggage for a lot of people?
Well, I failed a couple of times in my career, luckily, because I could learn from it. But I never felt threatened. So maybe I was fortunate to work in a company where this culture of you failed, so there will be a punishment somewhere along the line. I never felt that, so I must have been quite lucky. But something which we did from an organizational perspective, which has got a lot of impact, is our Dare to Try philosophy, is to really to come up with innovative ideas, to try them. If you fail quickly. If you don't fail, scale up quickly too. And it's that organizational. It's not just in Belgium, it's across the world that we are using that kind of philosophy, dare to try mentality. And it's almost a process we are following. It's not just a kind of idea and then we try it out. So it's thoughtful risk-taking because there is a process being followed, but at the same time, there is no punishment along the line if you fail. It's really try quickly, fail quickly, and then move up if you can.
Interesting. Any other?
Sure, I've failed a couple of times, miserably even. And it really hurt. I have my pride, so I think nobody wants to fail. But the importance is, I think, we're all in this rat race, and we think a career and a life, you start here and then it goes there, and the sky is the limit, and it all has to go better and better and better. And I think, maybe it comes with age, but I think we want too much. And we want everything of everything. And I think we need to learn to make choices in what we really think is important. And what strikes me many times is it takes people a crisis in their life to come to an understanding. They go into a burnout or they lose a dear one, and suddenly they make a radical career change, and they realize that the rat race they've been in, it's not giving them satisfaction. They're doing it because society expects it, family expects it, the neighbors expect it. Comes back to the authenticity. So there are so many dynamics around us that make us believe that what we do is what we need to do. which is also an element which makes failure such a fearful thing, because what are the others going to say? The moment you realize that in fact it's really about being in balance with yourself, and if you can go to sleep and say, I've done what I tried, I've done all my best to make it happen, it didn't work out, hey, I don't think I am to blame, then you get up in the morning, you take your learnings and you move on. And I think you get a better person out of that.
Absolutely.
Well, completely agree. When I look back, it's already a long career in the meantime. For many years, everything went smoothly, and I think I have one of these typical characteristics, wanting to be perfect on all levels, and to answer on the ideal on every level. At home, in family, for society, at work, and for many years this worked quite okay. And at a certain moment, I made a career move, and all of a sudden I saw, okay, it's not going as smoothly anymore. So yes, indeed, I also had my ups and downs, and it took me a while, because the first reaction is you want to be perfect, you want to answer the expectations of the environment, because okay, you made it, you made your career, and everyone thinks that okay, you know the answers, you know where you're going to, how it's to be done, and you realize that at some levels you don't know, and it's not going that smoothly. And that took me a long time, where I kept in the beginning the facade or the appearances high, and it made me very unhappy. It was a period where I was really unhappy with what I was doing and how I was doing things, and it's only it's when I started to be interested, to be honestly, in gender equality, in looking around what is happening, why am I feeling this, what is happening around me. And when I started to understand what were the mechanisms and what were the things that were not working for me, and I could accept them and then say, okay, I'm like this, and or you accept it, or we have a problem, it's at that moment that things went better again. So I really think it's important to have these failures, to learn from them, and indeed to grow again.
So, because I'd love to open it up for, questions from the audience, but just to sort of bring some of these threads together, which I think is very interesting. So, to some extent, what I'm hearing is that probably a key success factor in building an inclusive culture is that environment of truth-telling, open communication, self-disclosure, authenticity, and so on. So we can have the programs and the policies and the mentoring and so on, but if these conversations aren't happening and these exchanges at a very personal, authentic level, it probably encourages this so-called rhetoric reality gap that we see, where the language has almost gotten ahead of us so much that there's a lot of cynicism that's boiling up. And all of your examples reminded me too of what a CEO once said to me. He said, I was really getting frustrated with our lack of progress, and I decided that actually rather than complain about sort of a general phenomenon, I needed to take more responsibility. So he said, I started to walk down the hallway, Tabby, and ask my managers and executives, so what one thing would increase your engagement? What's one thing we could do? So he said, I woke up on a Thursday, thought, okay, my first day, first question. So he was walking down the hall, and this woman was approaching, and she said, okay, Louise, what's one thing that would really make a significant difference to you in this company in terms of your level of engagement? And she said, I'd like to come in at 10 a.m. on Thursdays. He said, that's it? She said, yes, that's it. And she said, this has been a major point of contention with my manager, who does not want to change this particular meeting, and I want to come in at 10. He said, consider it done. So he went to speak to the manager, and he said that was just such an appalling realization that oftentimes we believe or assume it's this grandiose issue, and it might be the most niggling aspect of something that we're trying to do well or we're trying to juggle more effectively. So he said it was a very big learning about let's get more granular about the realities here. Let's not hide behind the policies and the practices. Let me assume more responsibility as a leader of this company to get to know my people. I don't want them to be sort of anonymous, numbers that I see on a chart. And it reminds me of a study, again, not related to the workplace, but a group of radiologists in Israel just announced that they had come to a very interesting realization. So they were trying to figure out how they could read x-rays more accurately. So they said, we've got very good equipment, so we can't change that. Anyway, and then somebody made a comment and said, it's exhausting. You might look at, 15, 20, 30 x-rays in a day, and I have no idea who I'm looking at. So the light bulb went off, and they said, what if we had a photograph of the person whose x-ray we were reading? The accuracy level of the x-rays went up by about 25%, because that was their sense of personal engagement with the person. It's not just an anonymous x-ray. I have some sense of human connection with that person. So I think metaphorically that's a little bit of what we're talking about, is making ourselves accessible and available and true as leaders, and engaging in those conversations that I think bring life to some of these sort of more generic assessments of what we think our workplace cultures are like. But let me open it up at this point to the audience. We do have, I think, a few extra mics. If any questions?
Yes, thank you very much. I've been very fascinated by what was said about being authentic. And I just want to ask a question. Are there limits to being authentic? Why do I ask it? I'm sure that the current President of the United States is quite entirely authentic in the way he acts. Or let's say the President of Turkey or the President of another big power. I know I exaggerate, but aren't there limits which we ought to observe? If it's part of your personality to scream and shout at people, that's being authentic, but that's not really what we want. Excuse me if I use these somewhat
No, it's an interesting question.
somewhat extreme examples.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, being authentic is not about screaming and shouting. Being authentic, it's about telling your story in a respectful way towards the people you're talking to. And it's, for me, it's so natural that I do believe that you need to have, my emotional intelligence is not that high, yeah, but you need to have a basic level of emotional intelligence in order to be authentic. And I think most of the people do have that. Some of them don't. But that's, for me, it's not about shouting and screaming. It's about having a respectful conversation with the people you're confronted with. It's that easy for me.
I dare to have a different opinion. I think authenticity is created by the people who you're dealing with. If you would be alone in a woods, in a forest, are you authentic or not? You're always authentic. It's only the judgment by the people around you that create an evaluation of authenticity. I can imagine if you would put Trump in a certain environment, which I don't know in the world, who would absolutely love the person as being very, very okay. We, as a system, have created different levels of values, which me think that's an authenticity we don't like. But then you can ask yourself, what is the right we have to create levels of authenticity? Because actually what we're saying is, you are authentic if you are close enough to mine. And then, of course, you get to a very existential question. Who determines the levels of norms?
Mm-hmm. Any other?
which we're not going to answer today, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's even the public is asking very tough questions. It's if you want to be authentic, on the one hand you want to be authentic, on the other hand you also want to blend in. Nobody wants to be the odd one out. I've been to a conference about burnout organized by the female organization. I was the only man in the audience. I felt very authentic but very bizarre. So you really want to blend in, but on the other hand you also need differences and variances to make sure that you get a rich environment. But there is a certain level of span that you need to stay within. If it becomes too big, then you have, as a person, you have to make your own decision and say, I don't fit in this organization, and I need to find another one. But it's a personal choice that everyone has to make and see where his authenticity becomes a hindrance for him to function in a normal way. But I would agree with Karel that for me authenticity and respect go hand in hand. It's not an excuse for being abusive to others.
In your opinion?
Well, what I can add, I do think that every society has some values, and indeed, then you have to fit in the values or the culture where you're living in. And if your personality or your authenticity, no, how do you call it? Authenticity is deviating too much from these values, well, there will be no fit. And I think you can compare it also with the culture in a company. Indeed, in some companies, in some cultures, the fit is not there. And so, if you extrapolate it a bit to politics, well, to our values or to our culture, the way of behaving or the personality of some of the leaders today in the world are not really fitting. But yeah, that's then the problem, that they made it in the countries where they are indeed elected. So this has also a meaning. Yeah?
Well, no, we're raising actually a really interesting question about boundary conditions. So, and you may be able to help me. I believe his name was Sir Hunt, a chemist. He made a speech in Hong Kong about commenting on why there weren't more women in the sciences. And he said because women fall in love with the professors fall in love with the students, and then there's a breakup, and then there are tears, and there's no room for tears in the scientific lab. Well, you can imagine how viral that went. And I met with a woman who was who actually did a TED Talk at one point about why tears are really important, because it's a human emotion. So we saying that we are not allowed to show human emotion. And so it became a really interesting discussion in terms of, again, some of what we've been talking about, which is, you know, what are these boundary conditions? Are these norms or assumptions where institutions carry sort of dictatorially sort of this kind of behavior? So you can't cry in a scientific lab. Emotion and science don't mix. And her premise was actually it's fundamental, because emotion is where creativity comes from, you know, being able to feel comfortable, challenging, being evocative in the lab, et cetera, is very, very important. But it ended up being a major tweet battle, and there was a lot of trolling and so on about this issue of women in science and emotion in labs and so on. So again, this whole idea of authenticity, how we define it, you know, she was saying, I feel much more authentic when I can show my emotions. If you're telling me I'm less than a legitimate scientist because I'm crying, I just will simply not buy that. So I think interesting questions. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for your inputs. I have a question especially for Peter. This 6 batteries model is very interesting. each of these batteries is very difficult to put in place, and the 6 batteries at the same time is quite a mission. I would like to hear concrete examples of how you've put these kind of processes in practice. You've mentioned one detail of a case, if I understood correctly, with KBC, right, where you said that you had managers at the table with questions and everybody shared. But then how do you bring these managers to the table?
Yeah.
How does it happen? Thank you.
Yeah, we have developed an audit assessment where we measure the charge of every battery in an organization. And actually, some of you might have been working on a company because we are now finishing the surveys. And so we first do an as-is situation, and then we see what of the batteries, which one of the batteries is loaded, and which one is very empty. The ones who are very empty mostly drain energy from the ones that's very loaded. So if you, for instance, have a very good culture, which a lot of people have, but the strategy is very bad, the low strategy will finally impact the culture, and people start to say, what are we doing, where are we going? So the culture also, it's like leveling out the batteries. So that's the first thing, as is. Then we see which are the batteries that are loaded the least, and then what we do is we ask the top team, it's like, what are your plans to do that? So how will you move on to make sure this battery is loaded? For instance, if you say, well, we have 17 different approaches of project management, so people, we want cross-silo collaboration, which is a saying on stage, but then people go back to the office and they say, but you have system A and system B and system C, and say, we can't even collaborate even if you wanted to. So then we go back to the top team and say, guys, you have to align all this project management. What are you going to choose? And we make them choose. And we always say that if you are a banner, but you can agree to disagree. But once you agree, you have to commit. Yeah. And so that's what we did with the KBC. Johan Thijs, the group CEO, has fired 2 of his top people because they didn't align. Stimulate, don't tolerate. And so the top team is the source of energy. Yeah. If they are not aligned, nothing works. And so we put all these elements, like the low batteries, we put it on a strategic level, on top level. And they go for it. And they put senior people, like I said, they put senior people in charge. Like Erik Lutz, for instance, who was number 3, was in charge of one of these speedboats. And it's very low, it's very agile, very, very self-steering. And then we do a remeasurement 6, 8, 9 months afterwards, and we see the batteries are loaded. But even you don't have to measure it, because people say it. They say, oh my God, what a difference now. So it's hands-on. It's hands-on, and we always come back to the management team, say, guys, it's not because you have a strategy that people like it. Make a strategy that people like. Make systems that are aligned with your culture. Make systems that are aligned with your messages. If you talk simplicity, where is the simplicity in your systems? And it's very interesting conversations, and sometimes it's a lot of fuss. But the top team says, this is what we're going to do, these are the priorities, one band of brothers, and it rolls out. And that's KBC did it in 2 years. KBC is now seen as the example of all the banks in Europe on how they did digital transformation. But it's because of the top team. Okay.
Yes.
I wanted to comment on failures. My background is I raised with a friend a company, 2 companies with about 150 people, a girlfriend. We raised it together. We had small kids. And what I realized during all the time, that leadership always includes failure, because you are not perfect. You have some special abilities, and I think as a managing director, you have to build trust. The values are very important that you represent in your company. But we never learned commercial. We had never had commercial skills, because what we were trained in were other skills. So we needed people who supported us and who worked with us, and we had to find out those people. And that's always what I realized in my life, that it's really good to work with people and to find out what are my competences, to trust in other people, and to let them grow and be happy if they grow, if they are happy with what they are doing. So, and then you can overcome all the crises that you have in a company. We are running the company since 30 years, and lots of our competitors disappeared from the market. So we were often thinking about what is the success of our work. And but it's always, I think authenticity is very important in the business, and to respect that you are not perfect. And then you try to find people who combine the knowledge that you can bring in. So it's just a comment from my side.
Yeah, I think there is one big pitfall in that, is that most people are looking for copycats. So if they have a certain style, they look for people where there is chemistry. I as a general manager, I tend to look for people who even irritate me, because I know they touch a sore spot on me, and I think it makes a stronger team, as long as we respect one another in the discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. No grit, no pearl.
Maybe something adding on failure. I think, at least in our industry, you never fail as an individual. You fail as a team, and as a leader, you need to take ownership of the failure too, even if it's one of your teams that have made a mistake or went the wrong direction. And it's also that authenticity that you need to show that, hey guys, it was us. We made the wrong decision, and that's fine. But never pinpoint on someone individually. That would be a big mistake.
No, I think it's a very, very good point. Well, we're just about closing, and I was trying to think in my mind, again, weaving all of these different threads, and I was just reminded there's a wonderful, for any of you that are interested in interesting leadership books, there's somebody named Max Dupree, who's now retired, but he was the CEO of Herman Miller, which is a systems furniture company in the Midwest in the U.S. And he wrote a number of very reflective books about leadership and sort of his lessons learned. And he has a very poignant section of a book where he said, after a year or two after he retired, his daughter gave birth to a little girl prematurely, and it was very touch and go in terms of whether or not the baby would survive. And he said it was a very difficult time for us. So he went into the neonatal clinic, and he said, normally I'm quite confident in situations, but I was not confident at that time. And I turned to the doctor and I said, is it okay if I touch the baby? Is that good? Is that bad? And the doctor sort of reassured him, and he said, just make sure that your touch matches your voice. And he thought about that, and he thought, actually, that's leadership. When our touch matches our voice, and there's an integrity in how we lead people, there's authenticity and truth in the courage of our convictions, and we are there in that moment, being responsive to the demands of that situation. So I just wanted to leave you with that comment, because I think matching our voice with our touch is so vitally important in terms of creating that kind of inclusive environment, and certainly representing what we hope will be role model behavior. So let me please join me in thanking the wonderful panel for all of your great inputs.